As I said, policymakers are now increasingly realizing that mitigation cannot be perfect, that not all of climate change can be taken away, and that therefore adaptation is necessary. And this has led national governments to formulate national adaptation plans. Now, the international climate negotiations are often seen through the lens of greenhouse gas emission reduction, and it has not been particularly successful in that, but lots of other things have been agreed during the international climate negotiations, and one of them is that every country shall have a national adaptation plan. So this is now an obligation under international law. Poorer countries protested immediately, and therefore organizations such as the World Bank are now helping them formulate these national adaptation plans. Another thing that has been agreed at the international climate negotiations is that rich countries shall help finance adaptation in poorer countries. And all of this has led to quite a bonanza. What you're looking at here is streams of official development aid from 1990 to 2015. And what you see in green is that an increasing share of this money is being spent on greenhouse gas emission reduction. And then in blue, you also see that more and more money is diverted towards adaptation to climate change. And the sums are quite considerable. It's about $20 billion per year is spent on climate policy through international official development aid. The question is, of course, why? There's a lot of adaptation, I would argue, is private, not public. Why is the government, let alone the United Nations or the World Bank, involved in all this? Let's just recall the main reasons why a government can intervene in an economy. It is to correct externalities, it's to provide public goods, or to help with impure public goods and impure private goods, to prevent congestion and overexploitation. It's to remedy market power, and it's to correct asymmetric information. And in none of these, adaptation to climate change doesn't fit neatly into any one of these. So I think that adaptation is mostly private. Let's exercise this a little bit more, and let's look at the case of heat waves. Now, what you should do when it's very hot is you should wear little clothes, you should stay calm, you should not exert too much effort, you should keep out of the sun. Even when you're English, you should not go into the sun when it's very, very hot, and you should drink lots, but no alcohol, because alcohol actually opens your pores and makes you evaporate more. So you need to drink water or juice, those sort of things. Those are the things you should do. And those are things you know. And it is not something that the government should tell you to do. That is something that you should know. And it's only when you're talking about very small children that they actually need help. Because small children, when they're under 5 or so, haven't made a connection between the clothes that they wear and how hot they are. But if you're older and smarter and wiser than that, nobody should tell you that this is your prime adaptation to a heat wave. Now, there are public or collective elements to this. Siestas are an adaptation to heat. It is best to sleep through the day because you need to stay calm. It's better to sleep through the hottest parts of the afternoon and work later in the evening. That is actually an adaptation to heat. And siestas are much better if everybody else holds a siesta as well, because of the noise and because of expectations. Another adaptation to heat is that you have your dinner, the main meal of the day, late. And that is because digesting food actually heats up your body. So you want to do that in the cool of the evening rather than during the heat of the day. And again, there's a collective element to this. When are restaurants open is one issue, and also when are you expected to turn up at work or to turn up at a university to study. So those things do have a sort of a shared coordination aspect to it, but still largely private decisions. You don't want the government to tell you when you should eat your dinner, although they should make room for you to eat your dinner during the cool of the night. And perhaps perhaps universities in hot places should not organize, or perhaps universities in hot places should not organize lectures at 2 in the afternoon. But the government has no real role in this. The best they can do in these cases is to run a heat awareness campaign or to run a preparedness campaign to worry people, to warn people, or perhaps to tell people to check on their elderly neighbors and those sort of things. Although there's been a lot of experience with these sort of campaigns and they're actually not particularly effective. These are just private things that people should do. That is not to say that there is no role for the government during a heat wave. And a key example here of government failure is 2003 heat wave in France. It was hot all across Western Europe, but it was particularly hot in France. And so between 40 and 60,000 people died in France during that period that would not have died otherwise. And the reason for this failure was because it was August and it was France. And essentially what happened was that for the heat wave, a lot of people reported to their doctors with heat stroke and other symptoms of heat stress. A lot of people presented to their hospitals with these symptoms, but the doctors were closed and the hospitals were closed. A lot of doctors were on holiday, a lot of nurses were on holiday, and people simply did not get the health care that they needed. One of the problems was not so much that it was not recognized, but there was no procedure in place to call back nurses and doctors to help. And the only person who could do this, the only person who could overrule the procedure or create new procedures was the Minister for Health, and he was on holiday and refused to read the newspaper or come back from holiday and do something about this. And as a result, many people died unnecessarily. And this was a clear failure of the public sector. And the reason that the public sector here is important is because healthcare is publicly provided in France. Therefore, there is a public element to the adaptation. There's other things that were found out during heat waves, and this example is from Chicago. So what you need to do when it's very hot, you need to find a place that is cool, and if you don't have air conditioning in your home, a good place where there is air conditioning are shopping malls. So particularly elderly and particularly poorer people flocked to shopping malls just to stay cool. But security personnel in the shopping malls are expressly instructed to remove people from the shopping mall who are not shopping. And as a result, people were thrown out of the shopping malls, and later on a number of them died. So again, there's a public element to this, and you cannot expect the security personnel in shopping malls to work this out for themselves. They're typically not very well motivated and typically not very well trained, but the rules should be such that if there is an officially declared heat wave, then anybody should be allowed in the shopping mall, whether they're shopping or not. In Philly, another heat wave, they discovered other things. A big heat wave, lots of people died, and then they did an autopsy what went wrong, and what they discovered was that there were people who were sitting in flats and they had refused to open their windows, and they were slowly cooked to death in their home with their windows firmly closed. And the reason this happened, and this is what came out from interviews with survivors, was that people were so scared of the crime in these neighborhoods that they did not dare open their window. And essentially they were more fearful of the crime than they were of the heat. So again, there's a public response needed here, and that is that you need to have more officers on the street to create this sense of safety, at least in those places. where police officers create a sense of safety. It's what you need to do. You actually want to do that anyway. Any police manual will tell you that people get more aggressive during heat waves, and that has to do with people just get exhausted during heat, and people seem to lose part of self-control when it's very hot. And the result is that normal times your neighbor annoys you. During very hot times, your neighbor annoys you and you go and you clobber him over the head. Similar things happen with sexual crimes. The current evidence suggests that men lose self-control, and whereas in normal times they would think, that's a cute girl. During these times, during heat waves, they think, that's a cute girl, and jump on her. So that is another thing. And because of those two reasons, you actually do want to have more police presence on the street during heat waves to prevent these things from happening and give people that safe feeling that they open their windows. Another thing they discovered in Philly was that some people had air conditioning, some people had fans, but they did not turn them on during the heat wave. And the reason for that was simply they could not afford the electricity. So again, there's a public response here, and that is that you perhaps should subsidize electricity for the poorest when it's very, very hot. So to cut a long story short, really what you need is public intervention to complement private adaptation. And this goes for any impact where there's a large public involvement in how things actually operate, which is true for many, many things. There's also forms of adaptation where it's just a public good. And coastal protection is a classic public good, or should be a public good. Irrigation, it's an important means of guarding against drought. Can argue whether or not it's a public good as an economist, but it is often treated in many, many countries as a public good. Agricultural extension, that is the technical advice that is offered to farmers, is for sure not a public good, but in many countries it is treated as a public good and is actually paid for by the taxpayer. It's completely ridiculous that some small companies like farmers do get publicly subsidized technical advice, whereas other small companies like hairdressers do not get this, but that's the way it is. And if it is provided as a public good, then that means that the advice that is given to farmers, and that is done by public servants essentially, should be adjusted to incorporate the changed circumstances because of climate change. So there are forms of adaptation that are either public goods or are typically treated as public goods. It can also go wrong. The public the government can also get in the way of adaptation. And the key example of this is agricultural subsidies. If you look at Europe, then the reasons that subsidies are given to farmers are twofold. One is to shield farmers from market volatility. This is actually true across the world. As soon as prices go down, farmers cry for help and they typically get that help. That is true in Europe, that's true in the US, that's true in Australia, and so on and so forth. And the implication of this is, of course, that essentially the market signal is dimmed. That is, if you have a bad harvest that is because of climate change, then you get an extra subsidy. And as a result, you don't feel as bad and you don't have an incentive to change your ways because there's always the taxpayer to bail you out. So that is a bad thing that actually hinders adaptation. If you look at agricultural subsidies in Europe and you see those displayed here, actually a lot of those subsidies are to reduce regional differences between farmers, to make sure that all farmers earn a decent income. Again, the implication is that if you're doing something stupid, that is, you're farming stuff on a piece of land that is completely unsuited for this, then you get more subsidies because you're a poor farmer. And of course, this bakes in that we go for, essentially, we reward farmers for doing things that they should not do. And one of the implications of climate change is, of course, that farmers need to change their ways, not get stuck in their ways. This is actually being made worse in Europe because more and more subsidies are being shifted towards traditional farming. It's not what you want. You want farmers to do new things because situations are different. Similarly, trade barriers, again, this is not limited to Europe, but this is across the world, shield farmers from foreign competition. So if it is the case that rice farming is much, much better in Southeast Asia, much, much more productive in Southeast Asia than it is in Southern Europe, then we have trade barriers in place to make sure that the farmers of Northern Italy and Northern Spain survive. Whereas because of climate change, you may actually want people to shift production to the places where the crops grow best. And the whole system of subsidies, not just in Europe but across the world, is to lock farmers into their current crop choices and the current management practices, which is exactly the opposite of what you want. Circumstances change, then farming practices should follow.